In the most recent local elections, County Durham saw one of the most dramatic political shifts anywhere in the country. Reform UK went from the margins to winning a clear majority on Durham County Council, taking 65 out of 98 seats and wiping out much of what had for generations been considered Labour heartland. Yet, even within that collapse, there are a handful of places that held. Areas like Blackhall and the Hezeldens, former mining communities on the northeast coast. They remain among the last local bastions of Labour support in a county that was once part of the so-called Red Wall of the North. In this episode, I'm speaking with Rob Crute, a Labour councillor who represents this area. Rob grew up here, lived through the mining era and its collapse, and has spent years serving a community that has seen enormous economic, social and political change since the pits closed. For many people in places like this, politics has come to feel distant and unresponsive. That sense of disenfranchisement has played a major role in the rise of Reform, a party that until recently was largely seen as a protest vote. But we're now in a moment where Reform is no longer just rebellious or fringe. It's becoming more mainstream, drawing in former Conservative voters and politicians, and in places like Durham, actually exercising power at a local level. It may be too early to say whether Reform will become a future party of government in the UK, but the signs, particularly in communities like this, make it essential to understand what's happening on the ground. That's why conversations like this matter, speaking to people like Rob, who are living through this shift firsthand. It helps us understand not just why voters are turning away from traditional parties, but what that means for the future of places that have already been through profound change. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Joe Chambers Questions Everything podcast. I have a very special guest in this podcast. I'm joined by Councillor Rob Crute, who's Councillor for Blackhall and Hezeldens. It's an area where my family are from, so I know it well. And I have had the pleasure of meeting Rob before in other contexts. But I thought it'd be really interesting just to understand what's going on in the county of Durham, what's going on in that area, and what's going on more broadly in the country, and who would know best than somebody who's fighting on the ground. So, Rob, how are you today?
I'm not so bad, Joe. I'm sick of smiling at the moment.
Yeah, well, we all have that problem sometimes, but it's almost the weekend.
Yeah. I mean, everything has its problems these days, doesn't it? I mean, it's we're living in strange circumstances, aren't we, these days? So there's always this. I don't know, when I speak to people on the streets, there was always this bounce about people, and they're always quite happy or content. You've got the usual complaints, but I don't know. There seems to be an underlying fear and a bit, and people feel a bit disconcerted at the moment. And I'm sure we're going to go into that as we talk about, what's happening on the ground. But I think there's a whole mix of things going off, and I think that the whole point of it is that it's all about uncertainty and this lack of hope. Because even when we've lived in straightened times in the past, there's always been that little bit of hope, and I think people are starting to feel a little bit hopeless at the moment for a number of different factors.
Yeah, definitely. I think different communities, the mining communities, or even just more broadly, have probably faced more difficult challenges. But I think in the past there was a greater sense of unity or a vision of the future or a sense of hope. And I think one of the things that's lacking nowadays, partly because of leadership, whether that be politics or business, is a sense of a direction towards where we're going. And I think there are multiple factors that make people feel uncertain. What do you think is the reason why people around you in Durham, Blackhall, Hezeldens are feeling this way?
I think you're right when you said that, people had hope once over, but we had community cohesion then. And that cohesion, or striving towards cohesion, is being replaced by division. And I think that's been done for political purposes in many places. But in our communities, the pit communities of County Durham, you know all about the pit closure programme. When we had the pits, there was all virtually full employment. There were no housing issues, which has become a huge issue at the moment, by the way, because once over in Blackhall Colliery, where I live, most of the homes, the colliery houses, were owned by the pit, and the housing estate along at Blackhall Rocks, where your granddad lived, that was owned by the council. So if anybody stepped out of line, those organised housing companies would step in and get things put right again. Now, when the pit closed down, it wasn't just it wasn't just the loss of jobs that was concerning people. It was the knock-on effect where the bank closed down, some of the shops closed down, and going back to the housing issue, the big concern was that those houses would be transferred out. Now, a lot of them went to a housing company called Bradford and Northern, as they were known at the time. They became Accent shortly afterwards. Around about 10, 12 years ago, they decided to pull out lock, stock and barrel. So all of the housing stock that they had was transferred over to the private sector. And that's largely made up of individuals, many of them who don't live anywhere near Blackhall. They don't have any connection with the village. Consequently, they don't really care what happens in the village. They don't care about the condition of the property. They don't care about the nature of the people who move into those properties. Now, that's not to say everybody who lives in a private sector property becomes a problem, and it's definitely not to say that every private sector landlord is a bad one. We have a lot of private sector landlords who live locally. They provide a fantastic service. They're responsive, when the council or raise concerns about the tenants or the condition of the property. But there's a large element of private sector landlords from elsewhere, right the way across the UK, even from abroad. They'll buy houses on the cheap and they'll just move people in wherever they want to, wherever they choose to. And that has a huge unsettling effect on an otherwise settled community, because we've always been used to, knowing your next door neighbour. Yeah, I'm sure you've been told about the days when people left the front doors and back doors open. My family's from Heselden originally, and it was all similar, Colliery Rows all the way through. And people would generally leave the front door and the back door open. So rather than walk down the street and back up the other side, they would just cut through somebody's house to get to the other, to get to the next street. So all of that's gone. It all sounds very quaint now, doesn't it? But what people got used to is being replaced by something that's, it's quite unsettling for a lot of people who've been used to it. It's brought problems associated with drugs, with littering, with fly tipping, and it's all come together with, over a decade of austerity as well, where public services have been cut to the bone, cash has been taken out of the communities, it hasn't been replaced. Now, that's not to put, I'm painting a black picture here, aren't I? But there are positives to that as well, because we do belong to pit communities, and we still are a pit community, even though there's not a pit there. We do have this ethos of sticking together in times of adversity. When the pit was open, we ran our own colliery band with the penny on the pay from the miners. We had the outdoor scheme, which is the welfare park, which is still thriving now in Blackhall. It's run by the parish council now. And we had the welfare hall, which we still have now, but it's run by a community association now. So we still do have those facilities, but you feel you're fighting a losing battle sometimes. Now, going back to those housing issues and the private sector element, a few years ago, things came to a head. It just seemed like things were lawless in the village for a while. And we have monthly pact meetings, they're place and community together meetings. So they're organised by the place, and they're there for members of the community, residents, to go along every month and raise any concerns that they might have. Well, I always go along as a local county councillor, because a lot of the concerns relate mainly to the police, if they're crime issues, but for obvious reasons, a lot of them relate to the county council. So I'll go along there just to pick any concerns. Anyway, there was one day we went along, and the weekend previous, there'd been a couple of lads on the roof of one of the houses in 10th Street, and they were throwing bricks and slates down to the place beneath. And, they had the residents up all night, and it was absolute hell on in the village. So that pact meeting the week after was packed. It was absolutely stowed off. And we find with pact meetings, if you don't have many people going there, it's usually a good sign, because there's nothing really alarming going on in the village. But we went along this night, and it was absolutely stowed off, and we had to move to another venue eventually. people were absolutely fed up, not just of that single incident. That was an accumulation of all the incidents that have gone on before. And at the heart of it all was the people living in the private sector properties. So I went back to the council, and eventually it took a few years to get off the bottom. We introduced a selective licensing scheme, which in a sense it brings regulation to an otherwise unregulated sector, to the private sector. So the council now it runs a register, they have a list of all the private sector landlords, because one of the problems in the past was if you had an absent landlord, you didn't know who they were or where they were. So if there was a problem, you didn't know how to get in touch with them. But now you need to have a license to let a house in the private sector. And it gives the council that inroad into those properties, to those landlords, to get things put right. Subsequently, there's not just in Blackwall Mine, there's been some really irresponsible landlords who've lost their properties. They've been fined. They've been returned to the community. So that's got on top of the problem to that extent, and things are looking up in that regard. We're getting, less issues of fly tipping, problem neighbours, but they do still exist. And in a neighbouring village, I don't know if you know Horden very well, Joe, they have very similar issues there, but maybe it's a little bit more developed than in Blackwall, where they're facing almost housing market failure rather than just the antisocial element to it. And what they're doing there is looking to knock some of the streets down and rebuild. Now, it's proved to be contentious because there's some people living in those houses who've lived there all their lives. And what they're being offered is the value of the property as it is now. And we can imagine the value of an old colliery house isn't going to get you very far on the housing market in future. So you can see those concerns. So things like that tend to be contentious, but how you move forward and try and get beyond those problems. And I think the best solution would be if the council or the government or the homes and community agency, as it used to be, provided the money for the council to buy those houses and return that housing stock to the local authority, because I think it's best run by the local authority, because you have that local involvement through people like me and the parish councillors. And of course, you have the residents have that direct contact with someone local to deal with issues as soon as they arise. But that's been the main problem, Joe, since the pit's closed down. It's not just about the loss of jobs, it's about the community cohesion that's gone. It's starting to come back again. But the problems that were largely came through the private sector housing stock, that was a huge issue. But again, we seem to be making inroads in there at the moment.
And how has it been since the most recent elections where reform came out very strongly in Durham? How have you been able to help your community as a Labour councillor in the midst of the rise of reform in the county?
There have been changes in service provision. It's a little bit too soon to tell. It's only 8 months since we had the local elections. And you'll know yourself, I'm sure you spoke to your dad about this, where in East Durham, which is the area that we're from, we once had 21 Labour councillors, and I'm the only one left now in the whole of East Durham. And we only have 4 Labour councillors across the whole of County Durham. Now, if you'd mentioned that to somebody, if your granddad being alive now and you told him that, he wouldn't have believed you. It would have been fantastical to him. He just wouldn't have been able to get his head around that. But we are where we are. I know that there are gaps in some of the villages where residents are struggling to get in touch with the local councillor, the new reform councillors. In fairness, you do need bedding in time, when you become a new councillor. But I'm hearing tales from right the way across the county where residents are either phoning the local councillor, they're sending emails, trying all ways to contact them, and they simply can't. They're not getting that response that they've been used to. Now, I'm not blowing my own trumpet here, but when we had Labour councillors right the way across the county, we'd been around for years. We knew the ropes. We knew the way the system works. Contactable. We were everywhere. We were part of the community associations, the parish councils. Everything that moved in those villages, we were part of. Now, that's all fallen apart, which adds to this lack of cohesion I was talking about earlier. So we've got problems in that regard. And what I'm concerned about now, that was last May when we lost control of Durham County Council. There were another 9 councils lost control to reform last year as well. Bearing in mind there were only county councils up for election and Doncaster as an add-on. The council elections coming up in May this year are mainly the Mets, the boroughs and the district councils, the remaining local authorities. And I think that's going to be the acid test. For the first time, Reform have took control at a local level and haven't hit the ground running. Now, I'm trying to be fair to them by saying, they're new to this game, but they did make a lot of pledges that either they knew they couldn't keep or they didn't care that they couldn't keep. And it's my guess, although they returned 65 councillors out of 98 last May in County Durham, I don't think they really wanted that many. I think it's come too soon for them. I think what they were aiming for is maybe getting a dozen, 15, 20 councillors in, make some noise on the back benches and then take control in a few years' time at the next elections in 2029. But they're here now. They're in control of the county council. And before the elections, they were saying they're going to send the boats back. But most people, everybody knows, councils don't have any authority on boats, apart from the boating house in Durham City, like on the riverside. But they meant them type of boats. They said they were going to keep council tax down. Now, you can't make promises on council tax at an election in May when you don't know what the local government finance settlement is going to be until December. So it was a bit foolhardy, and you'll find that people who've been around for a while, they very seldom campaign on keeping council tax down because it's a thorny subject, and you can't make promises in that because you don't know what the local government settlement's going to be. You have to put the council tax up sometimes because you've had to. The last 14 years of austerity, that's always been part of the local government finance settlement. For a start, it's only been for 1 year, so you couldn't plan ahead. But the government would give a council a quantum of money and say, look, if you want the rest of it, you're going to have to raise locally through council tax. Now, that's been pretty much the same for years, and it's called cost spending power. Now, the people who came in to run this council 8 months ago mustn't have known about that, or if they did, they didn't really care about the impact of it. So they've been putting leaflets out, they've been talking to people saying, well, we'll keep council tax down, you'll be hunky-dory with us, we'll protect services as well, and we'll bring in DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency that was run by Elon Musk in America. Well, that went down a trade, didn't it? Because the both of them fell out, didn't they, Trump and Musk, about that very issue.
The black eye.
Absolutely, yeah. Now, that was never going to translate to a local level anyway, and I don't think you can ever do that. But as soon as they took control here, we had a meeting of the Corporate Overview and Scrutiny Management Board, which coordinates the scrutiny function, which essentially holds the executive to account. And I said, look, if you're going to bring these DOGE people in, the people I represent are going to want some safeguard here because you're going to be looking at lots of private data. We don't know if there's going to be whistleblowers on the staff side who might be included in that data. What are you going to do with that data? Who's going to own that data critically? Because you know what happens with data farming, don't you? People use it to make profit out of. In a political sense, they can use it for all kinds of nefarious purposes. And I said, we need to have those assurances, mind, if you're ever going to bring DOGE into this local authority or any other one. I know they tried down in Kent very early on where Reform were in control there, and they were chased off site. So that's never really happened as far as I'm aware in any other local authority, and it hasn't happened here. So they weren't able to protect the public services they said they were going to. They haven't been able to cut down on the cuts, and they haven't been able to keep council tax down. I had a discussion with one of the Reform members the other day. At the moment, we don't set the budget until next month, by the way. And at the moment, they're looking at a 3.1% council tax increase, along with £25 million in cuts to go with it. And he said, look, we're only putting the council tax up by 3.1%. That's nearly 2% less than it was last year. I says, but you don't recognise what it says in the budget papers. It's talking about a 3.1% increase. Doesn't matter what you do with the semantics, that's still an increase. You can't go around knocking on somebody's door saying you promised to keep council tax down and then tell them you're putting it up by 3.1%, which is less than it was before. It doesn't work that way. You can't do that. And they were warning on those same leaflets last year that, the council's facing £22 million in cuts. That number's now gone up to £25 million in cuts. So they're putting council tax up, they're proposing cuts to public services, and they're complaining that the government stiffed them. They're saying, we should have had more money off them. Yes, we've had an increased settlement from the government. Incidentally, it's the first positive finance settlement this council's had in 15 years, following, the last 14 years of Tory austerity. But they're saying they haven't given us enough money to wipe out all the deficit. Why, that was never going to happen. No local authorities ever had the deficit written off. You've always had the 4-year deficit through the medium-term financial plan. Like I said before, we've always had to manage that within a 1-year settlement. You haven't been able to plan ahead. At least now there's a 3-year settlement. The council is essentially £50 million better off. And the core spending power I mentioned earlier, that's gone up by 7%. Yet they're still putting council tax up and they're still proposing cuts. Now, a lot of the frontline services have been protected over the years, but it's like that low-hanging fruit. You get that first, but sooner or later, you're going to start cutting through to the bone. And my concern is, I think we've gone as far as we can with cuts, and I'm really worried they get into the fabric of communities and they start taking money away from local welfare associations, notably libraries. I'm really concerned about library provision. Now we have 39 libraries across the county. They could be easy pickings for anybody who wants to take them away. And what we're finding at the moment, whereas years ago, whenever it was proposed that council tax would go up, there'd be hell on, the eruptions on. Now you're saying, well, Reform are proposing to put council tax up by 3.1%. And you've got Reform voters saying, well, fair enough. Well, why shouldn't they? Because it's been run at the ground for the last God knows how long. So they're justified in putting that council tax up. I've never, ever known anyone justify putting council tax up and almost applauding them for doing it, because you're dealing with a lot of people who've been, I don't know, when they look on social media, they've bought into all this narrative that's being built up. And I've no doubt we'll come on to this, social media element of politics a little bit later on. But it seems to be that it doesn't matter what Reform do, it's hunky-dory. People are commenting on social media, Reform all the way. And I'm trying to get my head around that. And I know a lot of it's misinformation and disinformation, which is even worse. But that is one of those things that you're up against. So that's the next challenge coming down the line, the budget and the council tax setting. It'll be interesting to see what happens on the 18th of May, because we've had some Reform councillors, they go to, when they do go to parish council meetings or the community groups, they say, no, it's not us putting the council tax up, it's the cabinet. What they're not mentioning is it's their cabinet who's putting it up. So I've told these groups, well, invite them back to your meeting after the 18th of February when they've set the budget, and ask them who put the hand up for the 3.1% council tax increase. Because you can't evade that kind of, being in control of a council. It does mean that you're accountable for the first time, and it's the same with MPs, of course. Once you're in the spotlight, and you find him with Farage, he doesn't really like that level of accountability. He likes the spotlight on him, but he doesn't like the accountability and the scrutiny that goes with it. And we find that at a local level as well, and that's dangerous.
Definitely, I think for the longest time, Nigel Farage has been able to influence British politics without ever having to step into the mantle. And it'll be very interesting if he ever does get into that position, what sort of knock-on impact that has. But how has things been since Keir Starmer's Labour government came back? What have been the biggest differences from the Conservatives who were in power for a long time?
Well, there's a local government finance settlement as far as local government concerns. I mean, that's a huge positive. The government has done some positive things. Mine workers' pension scheme, the investment reserves being given back to the miners. They're looking now at the British coal staff superannuation scheme. That money's going back to the salaried staff who worked at the pit. They've done a lot of good things. Free school meals has been expanded. The problem, in one word, with the government is messaging. It's been absolutely atrocious. Now, normally when a new government's elected, they get a honeymoon of 6 months, 9 months, a year, if they're lucky. This government came in, what was the first thing they did? They took the winter fuel allowance away from pensioners. Now, everything that's happened since then, doesn't matter how good it's been, all overshadowed by what they did with the winter fuel allowance. And I know they've reversed that decision now, but all that tells people is, look, that's what they would do if they thought they would get away with it. So they haven't really, they haven't covered themselves in glory in the first year and a half that they've been there. And it's a shame, because there could have been a positive story to tell. And we all know that, there's a lot of hoarded wealth in this country and offshore as well. And people are sitting on it while you've got people in our communities who are struggling. Now, that allows groups to the right and the far right to switch the narrative around altogether, to saying, well, that money that used to come into our communities is going to pay all these immigrants who are coming over. And I think what the government's done, they've gone too far the other way, where they're pandering to Reform. You mentioned earlier where, Farage, his stock's gone up over the last over the last few years, and now that they're taking control of some councils, and they've got more MPs, although most of them have come directly from Boris Johnson's cabinet table. They are, they are going into positions of power, but you don't try and emulate them. The government has strengthened up its immigration policy. There's nothing wrong in that as far as it goes, because you can't have an open border policy. Everybody knows that. But at one point, they seem to be outdoing reform for cruelty and for coming down too hard on people who need help the most. And I'm not just talking about immigrants here. I'm talking about a lot of people. And that's been a failure. I think sometimes you have to face parties like Reform UK and the Conservatives and the Lib Dems. I'm not one of those people now who's going to forget about what the Tories did just because Reform's the main threat. They're all paying the same pot. They all need to be held accountable for what they've done. And that's one of the things about Reform. And going back to that point I made earlier on social media, doesn't matter what Reform do, it's thumbs up. Every time they do something, can't go wrong. But I think we're starting to see the table starting to turn a wee bit. You might have seen some of the polling over the last fortnight. Now, those same polling companies who were saying Reform was surging last year, everybody thought they were great. Now those same polling companies are saying that Reform's going back down. It's all false. It's all fake news. So you know the way it works, don't you? But you're getting a bit of a flavour about what happens when organisations do take control. It's that scrutiny and accountability I was talking about. So you're seeing them slipping in the national polls, and I'm seeing it happening locally as well. Some of the comments on Facebook, mainly Facebook, but sometimes Instagram. I don't use X anymore for fairly obvious reasons, but you're starting to see that narrative's breaking down, and the support that they have that was solid as a rock this time last year in the run to the local elections in County Durham, that's starting to fragment. And I think what you're going to find is that Reform isn't so much under pressure from the left, from the Labour Party, the Greens and the Lib Dems, or the leftish parties. I think they're going to suffer from parties further to the right as well. Now, out of the 65 councillors who were elected here in May last year, 2 have been expelled and 3 have resigned. So we're going to have the third by-election in a couple of weeks' time in Merton. But one of those members has gone over to Advance UK, Ben Habib's party, and you find that there's a lot of members from Reform leeching out of Reform into Ben Habib's party. Might be aware that Rupert Lowe, who used to be a Reform MP, he's thinking out loud about setting up his own political party, and I hope he does, because that's going to weaken, because the more that Farage is doing what he's doing, he's looking like he's becoming more establishment. Now, we've always known that he's part of the establishment. The man's a stockbroker. He went to Dulwich School. He's always been that, but there's always been that myth built up about him, because you've got a pint of beer in one and a fag in the other. He's just like us, good old Nigel. That facade's starting to fracture now, and people are starting to see through it all. And he doesn't help himself, going back to what's happened over the last few weeks, when you bring the likes of Nadine Zahawi in, you bring in Robert Jenrick in, and you bring in, Suella Braverman, sorry. You bring in people like that in. Now, that's a bit of a threat to Farage himself. It's a bit of a Trojan horse, because there's one thing all those 3 have got in common, those 3 people. They're all ambitious. They're all ambitious for leadership. So I suspect within a year, Farage will be facing a leadership challenge. He hasn't got the guts. He hasn't got the stomach for that, because you've seen what happened with UKIP first, then with the Brexit Party, and now with Reform. When the kitchen gets too hot, Nigel tends to leave. So I think there's all kinds of problems bubbling under for Reform. Too soon to say which way things are going to go. I think, like I said, the acid test is going to be the elections in May to see which way we go with that. But I don't really want to get too carried away with the threat that Reform pose, because although they are a risk, there are opportunities there as well, where you try and build up more of a loose alliance, a broad left, if you like, so some of the leftist parties. And beware, there's a lot of talk about, tactical voting. Well, that's the right thing to do. Well, it's the wrong thing to do. I don't really know. That's for people to decide which way they want to go. It happened last, the general election, didn't it? And I think one of the myths was that Labour won the election. Yeah, they did. They got a huge majority, but I think a lot of that was down to people not voting for the Conservatives. The Conservatives lost it as much as Labour won it. But there's a lot ahead to to get our head round to see where we're going to be in a year's time, 2 years' time. And I suspect in 2028, 29, when the next general election comes up,
Yeah.
I don't think there'll be many of the current party leaders leading their parties into the next general election.
Definitely. I mean, so much has changed. And just to talk about reform, and it was sometime a few months ago where they had somebody leave. He was a senior of the party. He came back 2 days later. So there's so much turmoil. Even on the left, you have your party with Jeremy Corbyn. There's lots of turmoil in that party. It could actually be the fact that the Labour Party goes more stable and slowly and just goes about its business. It could benefit. So much can change between now and then. I also think because Farage is almost like the American style of politics, the Trump style of politics, if Trump's fate, it becomes more and more unpopular with all the things he's doing in the world, that will then have a negative impact on politicians who emulate his style in the United Kingdom.
And I think that's opened a lot of criticism towards Farage as well, because I don't know if he has commented on what Trump said about, British troops and NATO troops. Yes, they helped the Americans in Afghanistan, but they were stood off the front line a bit. They lost hundreds of young lads and lasses on the front line. Now, straight away, Starmer came out, he criticised it. Almost everybody did, the national leaders, the European leaders, the NATO leaders, all condemned Trump for those comments. And he's done a lot worse than those comments, mind. But they all condemned him for it. Farage was very slow out the traps, and that hasn't gone down well with the service community, which is really a bedrock of support for reform in areas like this. So he hasn't done himself any favours in that regard. But there's also the alleged links with Russia. Nathan Gill, the party leader in Wales, serving a 10-year stretch now for his, links with the Kremlin. So none of that really helps. But I think with Farage, he's always been able to ride that storm, hasn't he? He's always been given a free ride. I think he's been on Question Time. Is it 40-odd times over the last few years? And he was a party until a few weeks ago with 4 MPs. Now, how do you attract that level of attention when you don't really have that much influence in what's going off? So I don't know if there's something happening behind the scenes where he's being pushed by an unseen hand. I don't know. Like I said, it'll all come out in the wash, but I suspect there'll be troubling times ahead for reform and for Nigel Farage. They've had it all locked their way for too long. And you're dead right what you say, mind, about them being too closely associated with what's happening in America at the moment. Now, when I've criticised the far right today, whether I'm talking about Advance UK or, Tommy Robinson or Trump, I express concerns that there's echoes there of 1930s Germany, and I'm often accused of hyperbole. They're saying, "Oh, you're over-egging the pudding, it's nowhere near like that." You look at what happened in Germany in the 1920s and 30s, where the economy is always, the plummeting economy is always the background to the rise of the right. You can guarantee it. There were other factors in Germany, of course. The settlement after the First World War, which was crippling German industry. There was a whole host of factors. But people started to appease Hitler, and you had a disorganized left in Germany that just sat back and they just, he's okay, just give him a few more feet, we'll be able to control him. And then by the time it's too late, you realise you can't control him. And that's what happened in America with Trump. And I do fear that could quite easily come over here. But you do find that Trump has his weaknesses as well. He's a loudmouth. He says he's going to do this, he's going to go kicking doors off and he's going to take over Greenland. He does tend to back off when he's confronted, and that's the way to do it. And we've got to keep on doing that, because I do have genuine concerns. I'm not saying we're heading towards World War III, and I'm not saying we're going to see a repeat in Europe of what we had with the Axis powers in the 30s and 40s of the last century. But there's always that risk there. If they're given untrammeled power and if they're allowed to hide from accountability and scrutiny, that we could be heading down that road. And we've got to be very careful about where we are at the moment. And you say that now with Trump, he's going to invade Greenland. He says it's for security purposes. I suspect it's more about the natural minerals that are worth trillions of pounds. I think that's what he's after.
Yeah.
But you've got some world leaders saying, right, it's okay, just let them do that. He'll protect us from China and from Russia. It's exactly the same as some of the world leaders did back in the 30s when they said he only wants a little bit of Austria, he'll be all right. Well, he doesn't really want that much of Czechoslovakia. Just let him have that little bit and he'll back off. Poland, well, it doesn't really matter that much. Before you know it, the man's took over half of Europe and almost all of Eastern Europe, and it's too late to do anything about it then. And I do worry that I'm not saying it could happen. Could happen, of course. I'm not saying it will happen. I'm not making predictions here, but we do have to heed the lessons of history and protect ourselves from what happens in the future.
So in New York, you had the election of a socialist mayor called Zoran Mamdani. As the right has a sort of resurgence, there is also a resurgence of more left-wing views. You do have the Green Party with Zach Polanski. But I want to know from your perspective, as somebody who was a miner, who came from a community where there were shared football fields and cricket fields, because I think socialism gets distorted as to what it really is and what I was sort of brought up to believe socialism is. So I want to hear from your perspective, what is socialism to you?
You've hit the nail on the head, Joe. But when you mentioned shared football fields and brass bands and welfare halls and things that we've been doing in communities for years, you remember when Cameron first came to power as Prime Minister 15 years ago, and he had this idea of a big conversation. Well, we've been doing that forever in pit villages, and that's the bedrock of socialism. That's what it's about. But it's about inclusion. It's about bringing people in, so everybody has a part to play. They all have a role to play in their community. Everybody contributes and everybody benefits. Now, we get people now saying that socialism doesn't work, it never works. I don't think we've ever seen socialism anywhere on this planet because it's never been allowed to work. You mentioned about the mayor of New York. And you do tend to get that. We had it last time when Trump was in control. Bernie Sanders made a huge push forward on the left of Democrat politics in America. Over here, you had Jeremy Corbyn, who, whether you like the bloke or not, he revived the Labour Party no end. You had young people kicking the doors down to get into the Labour Party. Things were active, things were vibrant. They had policies that actually reflected the needs of working class communities. And you all saw what happened in 2017 when Theresa May called the snap election. It completely wiped our majority out, where she had to rely on the DUP with a bribe to get support in Parliament. So it shows if you have a well-organised left opposition, an alternative, then you can make inroads. Problem was with Corbyn, as soon as the 2017 election was over, the alarm bells went off with the establishment, didn't they? They're thinking, Christ, we've got a bloke here with a beard who doesn't fasten his tie up properly, and he might take control in Parliament. What are we going to do? No, we'll smear him. And that's exactly what they did. Like I've said, I'll tell anybody who's prepared to listen, doesn't matter what your opinions are of Jeremy Corbyn as a man or as a leader of the Labour Party, that man didn't deserve to be brought low the way that he was. It was done in an underhand way. And worst of all, it came from his own people within the Labour Party, where you're being told today, you've got to coalesce around the leader because, there's a threat from the right. That was the same 7 or 8 years ago. They didn't coalesce around the leader then, did they? You had 172 of them signed a letter queuing up to stab the bloke in the back. Now, those same people are telling us we've got to get behind the leader. So, it cuts both ways. Now, I've always been a big supporter of, I've always been suspicious of leadership, mind, whether that's a council, trade union, or, or the government. I've always had suspicions of leadership, not individuals, just the whole ethos of leadership. But you do need to coalesce around something, but there has to be a consistent pattern there. Otherwise, you'll not be trusted in what you're doing. But going back to the original point, I think that's where the future lies. You've got to build up from the bottom. Everything that we had years ago, and I'm talking about, when your granddad was younger, when, the pit hadn't been going for long, and they had to find their own way. They had to build their own communities, essentially, because they weren't always helped by the mine owners before nationalisation. In fact, they were hindered. Through the Tommy shops, they got paid next and out, but what they did get, they had to spend in the coal owner's shop. So they had to build their own community, and that came through organisation, through the trade unions, through the Methodist Chapel in our area was, a really strong influence, but through the Labour Party, over 100 years ago. So it's building on those institutions that we already have and creating new ones. But going back to the original point, it has to be about inclusion. It's about everybody buying in. And that includes fighting back against those who would divide us. And that's the biggest threat we've got. There's this politics of hatred, suspicion and division that's really a risk that we can't afford to take.
I definitely believe in the movement of working class people, left wing movements, and I'm just my thoughts are: is the Labour Party still the best vehicle for that in order to progress working class people's values, especially in a time when there aren't as many big industries that like trade unions, because so much of the political infrastructure, you would decide who was going to be into councillor or the MP because they came through the community, they were educated by the community and vetted by the community because they had to sort of fit in with the principles. Now that those big industries have gone, that means you can get outsiders like the Reform Party come in because they haven't had to go through the sort of more rigorous process of being one of our own kind of thing. How do we reinvigorate that within the Labour Party so that it is reflective of the people that they're serving?
Well, you've got to ensure that the Labour Party has those democratic structures that it's always had. And I said had because you know what's happened with Andy Burnham over the last week. I think that's done Keir Starmer no favours. It's done the Labour Party no favours. It might not do the people of Greater Manchester any favours neither. We've had candidates parachuted in from all over the place, people who haven't been brought up in our communities. The Labour Party nationally has gone for those people who they want to have around the leader. And that's a concern. So it's going back to grassroots again and making sure that the grassroots run those. And we still have that structure, the branches and the constituency parties in the Labour Party, which is the real bedrock of support. You do have your struggles, you have to, you do have disagreements with the apparatchiks further up the line. And these are the people who are appointed to work for the party nationally. But it's how you take back control of those structures. I do think that the Labour Party, despite the way it's been seen and the way it's been portrayed over the last few years, is still the natural party of the working class. But I can see that disintegrating to some extent because the trade unions are mentioned, that they're withdrawing the funding, aren't they? Now, that means to me, if I was leading the Labour Party at the moment, I'd want to keep those structures in place and I'd want to bring those organisations in line as well. And the Labour Party has made a lot of good moves towards the trade union movement, on workers' rights, on the national living wage and things like that. And there's some good legislation going through the employment bill. It's all been crowded out by the things that are happening in the background, but there are still some positive things going. It's about bringing the trust of the trade union movement back again, because essentially the Labour Party is the trade union movement. It's the political wing of the trade union movement. We came out of the trade unions, and that is our lifeblood. We need the trade unions to survive. And the members of those trade unions, now your dad and your granddad would tell you, years ago when you had Labour Party meetings in Blackhall, it was essentially the NUM who run the route. But it didn't really matter because the two were aligned so closely. They all represented the same people, whether it was done on the union side or the party side. So they all work well together. It all meshed in together. And I think the Labour Party nationally has to be able to trust local parties to make their own decisions. Now, we're not seeing a great deal of evidence of that at the moment, but I'm hopeful it can be brought back in again. But we've got to win back the trust of the people as well, because I'll hear people saying, the Labour Party's they're doing this and they're doing that and the other. And yes, there have been some positives, but we've got to accept that we didn't do what a lot of people wanted us to do. We have abandoned some of our core support, certainly in communities where we're from, in East Durham and other parts of the country as well. I think expectations were raised, and rightly so. You've got to keep expectations up there if you want people to be positive, but you've got to manage those expectations. And I think a lot of promises were made, a lot of assurances were given that really weren't kept. And since I'm trying to pinpoint when this actually happened, whether it was pre or post Corbyn, but that trust in the party seemed to slip away from communities. I think it's building back up again at a local level, but the National Party has to win back the trust of the people who feels have let them down. Now, it's very difficult to do that because we're working against a narrative on social media that's heavily weighted. I don't really understand which way social media works. I know that they have algorithms that'll push certain information. I saw before the elections last year that there were people from all the way across the country supporting reform in my ward. People wouldn't be able to find Blackwall with a sat nav, yet they were, they were having a go at me locally. I don't mind that. If anybody wants to have a go at me, I'm elected. I'm there to be shot at. I've got no problem with that at all. But I'd rather do it face to face with people I know. These were people who were piling in, these bots that had been created to give the impression that reform's on the rise. Now that's disappeared a little bit, and you don't see that level of support for them. But with the money, the kind of money that they're getting in reform, and you put it against what they're getting in the Tory party, in the Lib Dems, in the Labour Party, a lot of those comes from the trade union movement, as I mentioned. But you've got individual donors handing over like £8 and £9 million to Farage that he can just swamp constituencies with before elections, before that short campaign where there's no limit on your spending. He can just pour money into them. He did it up here in County Durham, and it did the trick. So it's getting the structures right and maintaining them. But I do still believe that the Labour Party is the natural party of the working class, but we've got to prove it. And I don't just say that as a Labour Party member. I've been a party member all my life. Well, I wasn't. I was a communist before I joined the Labour Party. Separate story. But I think we've got to win that trust back before we do anything else. It's not going to be an easy task. As I said, you're swimming against the tide sometimes, but you've got to cut through that negative narrative and build up that trust again. And I think you'll only do that in local areas, like where we come from, at a branch and constituency level, but by building on those things that you mentioned while they're still there. Because the longer this goes on, the welfare parks that we spoke about, the community centres, the libraries, if this will get the way, they'll be gone. It'll be too late then.
And that's the real legacy of all the achievements of the working class labour movement, is the things that they brought about. And none of that was given to these people. They had to fight for it. They had to pull together and build it themselves. And in many ways, everything that people on the right or reform want, which is this almost form of self-governance where you don't need the government to help, is exactly what happened before, because people used their own money to make their communities better. Libraries, sports grounds, parks, workmen's clubs, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, you're right, and it's how you get beyond that. And when you're talking about how we deal with things at a local level, we've had to do that in the face of adversity. We've had to do it through struggle, but it's always been a generational thing. My mum and dad, but they weren't overtly political, they weren't activists, but they read the Daily Mirror, they voted Labour all the time, but they were engaged in the community. Your own granddad, and I don't know if you know this, you and me are related somewhere down the line. The two families, they converge at some point. But I'd known your granddad nearly all my life. But during the miners' strike, when that first started, I was only in my early 20s then, I was only a kid. He latched onto me, or I latched onto him in the welfare hall one day. He says, "Yeah, Bobby Crute, young one, aren't you?" I says, "Aye." He says, "Come over here." And he had put his arm around us, and we had a big crack on. He said, "You're going to do it this way, that way, and the other way." And he really brought us under his wing. Then your granddad was responsible for me getting onto the district council. So if anybody in Blackwall kind of standards, it's your granddad's fault, not mine. And he was the one who encouraged me to move on. You need more of that. But it's going back to that cohesion thing, isn't it? All those family links that we had, all the social links that we had. We had 13, 14 pubs and clubs in Blackwall not so long back. We don't less than half a dozen now. And that's been done deliberately. It's all part of Thatcher's, her mantra that there's no such thing as society. She made sure there'll be no such thing as society through things like the miners' strike and, ripping things out of our communities. So the only way we're going to build back is by relying on those things. But I say that it's generational. We have to get young people involved as well. Now, I'm not so sure about this idea about banning under 16s from social media. I know there's threats on social media, but some of the comments I see on Facebook, you far better banning over 16s from social media, not under. Some of the comments you see from older people who really should know better. That's where the threat lies.
And that comes from that sort of generational accountability. I imagine in the past, if you saw a group of young lads on the roof and some older gentlemen who were senior in the community saw that, they would sort them out, and that sort of thing would be self-governed and policed. I want to ask you, as we close about the Durham Miners Gala and what you think that is, what that represents to the community and where it stands.
That's something that ties pretty much everything together for my purposes. We're talking about community and about activity and about how these things pass on from one generation to the other. I've always gone to the big meetings since as long as I can remember. I remember, well, the first one I can remember, I was about 4 or 5 year old. And in those days, we used to march the banner with the band through the streets before we went through to Durham. This is about 6 o'clock on a Saturday morning, mind. People hangovers getting banged out of bed by the drum going past. But you used to go around the villages after the big meeting as well. And I was about 4 or 5 year old, and my dad gave us the string to carry, the guide ropes at the front. And I carried that string, my little heart nearly come out my chest. I was so proud of it. And I've always had that feeling, that connection with the big meeting, with the banners, with the bands, the messages on the banners, and that's our true hope. That's where our saviour
Yeah,
lies, in organisations like that. Now, you'll be aware, of course, coming from the similar background, that it's burgeoning again. The big meeting, it's getting back to the 250,000 people attending, and it's needed more now than it ever was before. And it's going back to what it was like when I was a kid. But the thing is, it needs funding as well. So the Durham Miners Association, they've set up a group called MARAs to try and bring money in from ordinary working people and anybody who wants to join, to bring that money in to keep the big meeting alive, because it doesn't just matter to our communities. It's got a national and an international aspect to it. As people come from all over the world to
yeah,
the big meeting, it's just one of the biggest celebrations of labour and trade union history on the planet. And if you lose something like that, it's kicking the legs away from our communities. So I think you have to keep things like that going, and that's an absolute essential, mind. I can't imagine life. I know it only happens once a year, second Saturday in July, but if that big meeting wasn't there, we'd be so much the poorer for it, mind, all of us,
yeah,
whether it's individually or as communities. So we need to keep that going. It's always been the bedrock of our communities. Some people absolutely loathe it for obvious reasons. Reform UK were very critical of it last
mm,
year. We got a bit of a lip on because the DMA said they wouldn't be invited onto the platform. Historically, they've always invited the leader of Durham
yeah.
County Council to go onto the platform. They would often speak. But they said this year around, but doesn't think it's appropriate because Reform UK don't really align with the values and the traditions of the big meeting. So we're not inviting you onto the platform. They weren't banning anybody from going. Now, if they want to still go to the big meeting, they're quite welcome to do it. But that was translated by Reform UK as though they'd been kicked out of the big meeting. They weren't welcome. They weren't allowed to go along. So they made a big fuss about it, like they always do. We had negative out what I thought would have been a positive. It worked against them eventually, because I think everybody knows, regardless of which side of the political divide you're on, the big meeting is an absolutely essential, it's an essential event. And I've seen Lib Dems there, I've even seen Tories there. I mean, they don't identify themselves, mind, but I've seen people from right the way across the political spectrum, because it is a political thing, but it's a cultural thing as well. It's about our heritage, it's our legacy, it's about what we're all about. So we've got to, as a basic minimum, we've got to keep things like the Durham Miners Gala going and expand them as much as we can, and then branch them out into other organisations, into other forms of activism.
And I think the defining thing about the Durham Big Meeting, and also just coming from a mining background, is pride. I think
Mhm.
people that come from these areas are proud people, and I think what we need to make sure we don't lose is our pride, and we remain proud, and we carry the banners proudly and show that we're still here and we're still sort of unbowed, and we're proud of everything that we fought for, and we came together and we celebrate together everything that we've achieved.
Yeah, you're dead right, because it is about pride in your community, and it's about the resilience of our people as well. We've talked about the miners' strike and how, they try to close our communities down. Yeah, we lost the miners' strike, but it reinvigorated an interest in politics with a younger generation, people like me who may otherwise, I don't know what I've been doing if it hadn't been for the pits or the miners' strike, but it politicised the whole group of people, and it built up that resilience in our communities, not just in Durham, of course, but in mining communities right the way across the country. And it's when you have opportunities like that, when you meet every year, you see people in other parts of the country where you haven't seen for a full year, if you don't stay in contact with them, you exchange tales, and you talk about achievements and where things have gone wrong in your own community. You swap ideas, and that's what it's all about, that connection, that cohesion between not just communities, because my politics, and I know your dad and your granddad are the same, they've always been class-based politics. You've got more in common with the Scottish shipbuilder or the Welsh riveter than I'll ever have with some chinless wonder in the city who's making a profit off somebody else's misery. And that's why I reject these politics of nationalism and division, because they're not relevant to our communities. Our politics is class-based. It's about working class communities and how we get them back on the footing that they deserve to be on. And we're moving in that direction, but we've always been facing a headwind. And I think it was Tony Benn once said, there's no final victory, just the same fight over and over again. So toughen up, bloody toughen up. And he's dead right.
Yeah, it's like football, I guess. Every season you have to start again. And speaking of seasons, what do you make of Sunderland so far this year?
Well, I'm curiously happy, and I've never said that. I mean, I've had a season ticket for 35 years now, and I've never seen anything like the things that are going on in Sunderland at the moment. And it's surprising a lot of people as well, because essentially it's a new side, apart from 3 or 4 players who got us there from the Championship. And it's very rare you see a team come together so quickly as they have. But we got that lad in the middle, Granit Xhaka, who's like having a manager on the field. Problem is, if there's no reliance against him, like, if he goes missing like he did against West Ham last week, you get 1,000. So you've got to be careful not to become a one-man team. But if you look at the quality of some of the signings that we've got, it just shows the organisational depth at Sunderland. The people who took over, the owner, the scouts, the manager, everything, is pulling in the right direction. Well, I'm going to touch wood, because we haven't got to May yet. We'll have to have this conversation in May, see where we are. But, we're not going to be relegated this season. And we've always been haunted by worries every single season, as long as I can remember. There's always been a drama at Sunderland. We never finished mid-table. We're always pushing up there to get where we want to be, or we fighting relegation. So it's nice to have a couple of months ahead of you where you're not chewing your fingernails down every time you go to the match on a Saturday morning.
Yeah. Well, I hope you enjoy the match this weekend. And yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you. It's great that the community that my family are from have somebody who is from the community who's really proud and fights for the community, has done for so many years and will continue to do so. So it's an honour to speak to you. I'm really glad you gave me your time. And yeah, lots of things are going to happen between now and any next election. So keep fighting a good fight.
It's been a pleasure to speak with you, Joe, especially given the family connection and, how close I was to your dad and your granddad. It's been lovely to speak to you. If you're coming up to the big meeting, let me know beforehand, and we'll have a couple of pints together.
Sounds good. All right, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Joe. Take care, man.
Cheers.
See you soon.